Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Are You Ready to Garden? Tonight is episode 13, and we are going to talk about brambles and blueberries. And our colleague Peter Nietzsche is going to be on in a few minutes to talk to you and provide the next hour and a half of a lot of great information that'll help you in your garden and also in your selecting produce. Welcome, everyone, once again to tonight's program. And I want to thank all of our people that have been coming back week after week and join us for the program because it's been our pleasure to bring this to you. I also want to thank our sponsors, the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. We wouldn't be here without the research and all the good works that are done at the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. And that's the mothership for Rutgers Cooperative Extension. So we work together with all of our colleagues at Rutgers in the Experiment Station and through Cooperative Extension to deliver information throughout all the counties in New Jersey. We're very fortunate to have many freeholders that are extremely supportive throughout New Jersey, and the only reason that we're here is because we have freeholder support, and we get that great support that allows us to function in each one of our counties. So between the Experiment Station, the federal and state support, we're able to bring cooperative extension right into your home. So without further ado, let me just give you a little background. Our speaker tonight is Peter Nietzsche. Peter is my colleague, and he's an ag agent with Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Morris County, New Jersey. He conducts most of his programs in vegetable and small fruit production and marketing. He has a BS degree in plant science and an MS degree in horticulture from Rutgers. He's conducted research on a wide range of crops that focus recently on tomatoes, strawberries, and some very unique ethnic crops that he's letting all of us try and getting out there and also getting the growers pretty darn excited about some new crops that he's working with. So we've got an exciting topic tonight that is very timely because of blueberries and brambles being in season right now. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Peter Nietzsche. Pete, it's all yours.
Well, thanks very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be on tonight and a pleasure again to talk about some of our summer small fruit. As Bill was saying, we're focusing on brambles and blueberries because they're in season right now. They're just starting the season in different areas and will be for a couple weeks. And we're going to talk first a little bit about growing them in your home garden. So hopefully you can be successful doing that. And if not, we'll talk a little bit about buying them from a local farm stand or pick your own operation. One of the things about brambles and blueberries are they are delicious and nutritious, a lot of antioxidants in these crops. They can be a little bit pricey sometimes at the store, so hopefully we can be successful in teaching a little bit about growing them in your home garden. So the first thing when you're growing any crop is picking where you're going to plant them, and it's important, very important with small fruit like brambles and blueberries to pick a good site. One of the first things you want to look for full sun. There are small fruit that will grow in the woods in New Jersey, but they will grow the best and flower and fruit the best if it's done in full sun. We also, like many crops, they like well-drained soil. They don't like wet feet. We don't like to see puddling anywhere. So if you're looking around right now, or maybe after the recent storms, if there's puddles, that's probably not a great place to plant your brambles or blueberries. So we want good, well-drained soil. Something we don't always talk about with some other crops, we also want good air drainage and movement. The small fruit sometimes is susceptible to diseases, and so we want some air movement to dry them out. And occasionally we can get a very late frost, and that might frost the flowers of these crops. And so, as you see here, you want to avoid those low areas where frost pockets may settle, air settles, and you don't have good air movement. We'd want to be up on a ridge or out somewhere else that there's not a low spot. We also want to avoid areas where there's competition from trees and shrubs. Again, sometimes we'll see brambles growing on the edge of woods, but they're in competition with tree roots, and so for water and fertilizer, and so they're not going to do so well from that. I tell people if you look up in the air and you see tree branches and leaves above you, you probably need to move away because there's probably roots below your feet. And again, those are going to compete with your brambles and blueberries for water and nutrients. So we want to move away from the shrubs, get them out in an area away from that in full sun and good air movement. So first we'll talk about brambles, and if you're not familiar with brambles, what we're talking about and will be talking about in this presentation are crops that are all related. They're in the plant genus Rubus, and one common thing is many of the cultivated types have prickles or thorns or spines along them. There's, of course, exceptions in nature to everything. There are some thornless blackberries that you can grow in your home garden, but most of the members of the bramble family get their name from those thorns and getting caught up in the bramble we talk about. This is a red raspberry here. These are aggregate fruit, and the little pieces here are drupelets that make up the fruit. And you see here with a red raspberry, they come off the core or the center of the receptacle there, and you eat them, and they're hollow. Whereas blackberries, a different crop, is not hollow. You pull off the whole thing and consume it. So we're going to talk tonight about raspberries, both red, gold, black, and purple. We'll talk about blackberries, thorny and thornless. And there are some other crops like loganberry and youngberry and boysenberry that are blackberry-raspberry hybrids. They are grown in the Pacific Northwest and other areas that don't have as harsh winters as we do. So they're not really appropriate for New Jersey. So we won't go into those too much tonight. Brambles are a long-term crop, a perennial plant that will grow for many years or more. So with any crop, we do suggest a soil test, but particularly when a crop is going to be in the same place for many years, we suggest you run a soil test through our lab. This will come back with what the pH of the soil is. It'll tell you how to adjust that pH to the proper range of 6 to 6.5 so that the brambles will grow well and be able to take up nutrients properly. It might recommend lime in order to increase the pH. Usually our native soils in New Jersey are a little bit lower than that, so often it'll tell you to add some lime. It's also a good idea to add amendments. Again, the plants will be in the same place for many years, so amendments that add organic matter and nutrients like compost and manure are good things. We tend to want to add well-rotted manure and compost so that we don't burn the plants from fresh manure or compost, and particularly for food safety issues, these are crops we're going to have a crop from and that we're going to consume, so we don't want fresh manure around an edible crop. Typically, we're talking about planting raspberries and brambles in the spring, and so that's typically the production practice. And when we talk about purchasing or ordering nursery stock, this is the example on the left is typically what you would get. Sometimes you'll see boxes of brambles in the big box stores or garden centers, or also if you order them mail order, typically you get kind of a cane or a stick with some roots. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of growth, but these plants, these canes are harvested in the winter and stored cold and then shipped to you, or shipped to the big box stores or garden center, and then you bring them home dormant, and then you typically in the spring want to get that plant planted right away. It'll break dormancy, start growing, and then you'll have your bramble established. The one thing I'll note here is the label indicating the variety. That's something you want to hold on to and keep track of. It's important with any plant, but particularly with red raspberries, there's different types, and we want to know that in order to have the best growing practices. At this time of year, if you're still looking to buy plants or grow brambles, you would be looking to get potted brambles, maybe in a gallon pot or 2-gallon pot already established with roots. They can establish in the fall. The challenge this year is everybody's interested in gardening, and a lot of the garden centers have sold out of a lot of things. So you may have to look a bit in order to get your stock at this time of the year. As far as planting and spacing, brambles can get quite large. As you see in the picture here, that's a blackberry bush that someone was trying to grow in a community garden. You can see blackberries get 10 feet by 10 feet, so they need a lot of room. Some of the community gardens have height restrictions, so they were kind of trying to obey the height restrictions, and you can see them bending the stems around. Kind of a challenge to grow such a large plant in a community garden. But the idea here is with spacing is you're planting in a row 2 feet apart, but between the rows you want to give a lot of room because, again, a raspberry can get quite large and a blackberry even larger, 10 feet by 10 feet. So you need a lot of room in between, particularly if you're growing a bramble that has thorns. You want room to move around and harvest that crop. This is a small commercial planting, and I show this slide for a couple of reasons. One is to show that how far apart they've established these rows. They don't look like much now, but these raspberries will fill in and fill this row. This particular grower was using plastic mulch for weed control the first year. He was going to then cut that out and then allow those brambles to fill their row. I'll show you a picture in a second where they fill the row. And he was just looking at white on black plastic versus black to see which established better. I never got back to him to see which one he thought, but both probably controlled the weeds well and established the brambles well. The other take-home message from this shot is that sometimes when you plant in the spring and you plant that dormant cane, it takes a long time to establish the root system. And a plant always wants to establish its roots before it puts out a lot of top growth, leaves and stems. And so you can see sometimes there's some plants are slower than the other. This one, you may not be sure if it's dead. You can see this one is just starting to get going. So don't abandon ship too quick if you plant a dormant cane. It may take a little while longer. You might want to take your fingernail and scrape the bark off the cane and see if it's green or brown underneath, and have a little bit of patience because it may be just establishing the roots and will fill out and come on a little bit quicker later. So as far as fertility goes, and here's the brambles after they've established for a while, started putting out runners and fill that bed, that row. Again, we want to see a nice distance between here, and we will fill that row with bramble canes over time. The best bet for fertilization is to follow the recommendations of the soil test, but from our fact sheets and materials, this is a general recommendation. If you don't have a soil test, of a general kind of a balanced fertilizer that to put down the first year and the years after that. Again, we don't know for sure without a soil test whether you need as much phosphorus and potassium, but the ratios here are that the first number is nitrogen, second number is amount of phosphorus, and the third number is potassium of the fertilizer. So a balanced fertilizer, if you don't, in the lack of a soil test, can work for you, and that's what you need for good bramble production. So this is where we get into the idea of keeping that label when you purchase a plant. Keep it around so you know which type of raspberry you're growing. So the first type of raspberry we'll talk about are the red and gold. And within the red raspberries, there are both floricane, or what's called fruiting, or also called summer-bearing raspberries, which are bearing fruit right now. And they only bear fruit on second-year canes, which are called floricanes. And so because of that, you have to be careful on how you prune them every winter in order to maintain the primicanes for the next year and get a crop. And we'll show you some images of that in a second. There are also primicane fruiting, or what's also called ever-bearing red raspberries and gold raspberries, and they bear fruit on both first-year primicanes as well as second-year floricanes or old wood. And so what makes these easier or more attractive to farmers and some gardeners is that they can mow down the crop in the spring and just get a single crop in the fall. They don't have to worry about deciding which is a primicane, which is a floricane, and doing selective pruning for that. Some growers leave a few floricanes to get a summer crop, and then the primicanes come on later and have a fall crop. But again, you need to maintain and know what type of red raspberries you have in order to know how to prune it. So this is just an example of how a primicane goes from a root bud here to a primicane the first year, and then the second year that would be considered a floricane. So it takes 2 years to go from a primicane to a floricane, and that's how a raspberry develops. So starting with the summer-bearing or floricane-bearing red raspberries, there's a lot of different varieties to choose from. And if you want to have a big crop and extend your season from mid-June all the way to mid-July, you can plant different varieties of red summer-bearing raspberries from a range of different ones. These are some of the ones we recommend for New Jersey. And then so if you plant one or two from each of these groups, you'll extend your harvest from early season to late. And this is an older slide of red raspberry. This is Lauren, an older variety out of the past Rutgers, Maryland breeding program. You can see some nice big fruit there. There's a quarters there next to those red raspberries. Nice big juicy fruit there of Lauren, an example of a summer-bearing floricane fruiting red raspberry. So again, knowing which type of raspberry you're growing determines how you prune them. So with summer-bearing red raspberries, we'll go through some pictures of the process, but first you would remove any dead canes. You remove the floricanes that have fruited that year. You want to thin that row down to 3 to 5 canes per linear foot, and then narrow the rows to 12 to 18 inches. And this is an illustration of what that would look like. We get rid of the dead and flipped over canes, and then thin them out and thin the row and leave the primocanes and take out the fruited canes from that red raspberry plot. And this is a couple of pictures of a floricane fruiting bed at one of the local farms. So there it looked like before they pruned it, and then they came in, removed the floricanes, and left the primocanes to fruit that second year. How do you know which one is a floricane? So if you look at the canes, often you will see the flower structure and know that they have fruited that year, that past growing season in the late winter when you're coming out to do your pruning. Sometimes you see fruit that were not picked. And so those are some clues if you're doing it in late winter. The other thing you can do is just wait and see which canes later in the spring leaf out, and the dead ones will be the floricanes, or they've died from other reasons. So you can prune these out, and then you would leave these as the next fruiting wood for the second year. So that's the one type of red raspberry. We also have primocane-bearing red and gold raspberry varieties that you can plant. The harvest season for those, if you prune them to the ground, is around late August to frost. And so these are some of the many varieties that are available of red primocane-bearing raspberries, and then there's a few gold varieties as well. Heritage is one of the old standard varieties, has been around for many years. If you don't know what primocane variety you have, there's a good chance it's Heritage. You know, best thing to do is save that label so you know which particular variety you have. So that's been around for many years. There's other ones being developed that may be better for you. And this is another variety out of the Rutgers, Maryland breeding program, and one of the bigger gold varieties, something you might want to grow. Again, some of these things can get quite pricey in the farm stand or supermarket. Probably gold you probably can't even find in the supermarket, particularly of good quality. So you're going to need to get that from a local farm stand or grow it yourself if you want gold raspberries. And here's kind of the advantage of primocane types. This is a primocane plot of red raspberries, unpruned, and this is the plot pruned. So you don't have to worry about selecting canes and floricanes and really doing any judgment. You can come in with loppers or a strong line trimmer or a line trimmer with a blade on it, cut them all to the ground. Because they don't rely on older wood or the floricanes, they can fruit from the primocanes. You can just cut them to the ground and then come back. They'll grow back, the primocanes, and then come back and fruit in the fall for you. So that's kind of the advantage of the primocane type, no thinking pruning practices for that. You can also grow purple raspberries, kind of not too many of those growing around. I was just looking and asking some growers, and I couldn't find a grower locally that was growing them, but the main variety is Royalty, and they are a hybrid between red and black raspberries. They can be harvested when they're red, and then also you can wait a little longer and they turn a purple color. So they're more of a purplish hue to them. Harvest season early to late July for purple raspberries. Pruning for purple raspberries, again, we're removing dead canes. We're thinning the canes down to 3 to 4 canes per linear row. And then actually we're doing some topping to promote branching on purple raspberries at 3 feet in height so that the canes that you leave are more productive. Black raspberries can also be grown in the home garden and are grown locally. The harvest season for those has started, and it's mid-June to mid-July. Bristol is one of the common varieties that grown, and there's a couple others. Air Jewel, Black Hawk. You note that they are significantly smaller than red raspberries. That's a nickel instead of a quarter there on that fruit. They are sometimes confused with blackberries. They are two different things. So black raspberries are different than blackberries. You'll note they're hollow, whereas blackberries are solid, the fruit and the drupes of those. They look a little bit different than the red raspberries in that they grow from more of a crown. They have more of this lavender sheen to the stems of those. They do have thorns up and down those canes there, but they grow from more of a crown. They don't root underground so much or fill the row. They grow from these crowns. And so the pruning practices are slightly different than red raspberries. In the summer, actually, we're coming in and topping those canes to 28 to 38 inches, 36 inches tall in order to promote branching. That gives you more fruiting wood the second year when they turn into floricanes. In the winter, then we're removing dead canes, and then we're thinning out to the healthiest 5 or 10 canes per plant so that we get the best harvest from black raspberries. And this is an illustration of black raspberry pruning. You can see they're growing more from a crown. You can see they're topped off there and then thinned out a bit in the winter. One thing that's different too about black raspberries and can be good and bad, when the canes come down and hit the ground, they often root and form a new plant, which is great if you want a new plant, which is not so great as they can sometimes take over a garden. I bought a house and inherited a whole garden full of black raspberries and nothing else. And it took me a few years of digging to root some of those out and reduce the amount of black raspberries so that I could grow some vegetables in the area. So they can kind of be invasive a bit with that practice. It's nice if you want to share a plant with a friend, but it's not so nice if they take over the whole garden. And then moving on to blackberries.
Peter,
yeah.
We have just a few questions, and you actually just started, you did cover one of those questions about raspberries being a little bit invasive. So in terms of containing those, what would you recommend in terms of containing them within one area of your garden?
Yeah, well, I mean, the blackberries, you're going to want to top them so they don't touch the ground, the black raspberries, excuse me. So that allows them to root and take over that way. So you're keeping them pruned back yearly and timely with that. The red raspberries can be challenging too because they'll expand that row over time, and that's why you kind of want to have maybe grass in between and mow them off, the runners that come up in between the rows, and just continue to mow that off, bring them back so they don't take over. You also try and create some kind of barrier in the soil so that those roots don't come through. But they'll probably find their way under. They're strong, vigorous plants, so they tend to take up some space.
There's another question from Susan. She asked about using cuttings from established brambles to start new plants. Anything that she should be cautious of in doing that?
Yeah, there is a couple of virus diseases, and we'll show you a picture of some of the symptoms of that can get into brambles. So if they're healthy and vigorous and pretty new, it's probably okay. But if they've been in the ground for years and you have other brambles, and if you see any distortion of the leaves or mottling, you probably want to stay away from that plant because it may have a virus and you're just going to propagate that virus. So we'll talk about that in a second under problems when I finish blackberries. So blackberries are, as we said earlier, grow even bigger than the red raspberries, and the purple and the black raspberries, but they are a different crop. They have larger fruit than black raspberries, and they grow as both thornless types and thorny. And there's some discussion amongst gardeners oftentimes which varieties taste better. Some people swear the thorny types taste better. I wonder if those gardeners like the blood taste that they get, because those thorns are pretty aggressive on a blackberry bush. But there are newer varieties that are thornless, and breeders are getting better and better at improving the flavor of the thornless, as well as the winter hardiness was an issue early on with some of the early thornless varieties. As far as pruning blackberries, we want to shorten the laterals to 18 inches and thin them. They are like the black raspberries in that they grow from a crown. And again, this is that shot in that community garden where they're trying to maintain it in a small space, a very large plant for a small space. So it can be a challenge, but here's another visual shot of a pruned and unpruned plant. And you can see that plant was probably 10 feet by 10 feet, and we're taking back a lot of wood to get it, to maintain it, and then leaving the strongest canes there and young canes so that they're vigorous, and then refill the space the next year, and we'd have a good strong harvest of blackberries. And there's just a visual of a blackberry unpruned and pruned, showing you do get a lot of growth every year. You don't really have to be too nervous about over pruning, because they really come back strong and fill the space. And as we mentioned, there are both thornless types and varieties. There's a lot of new thornless types out of the University of Arkansas. These Native American names there are coming out. Also, the Triple Crown was out of the USDA. Newer material that are much improved over some of the older thornless types. So I think people are adopting them more now. But again, some people swear the thorny types taste better than the thornless. So if you want to brave all those thorns in that pruning process, you're welcome to. But I kind of prefer the thornless types. And what's really a recent introduction out of the University of Arkansas are primocane fruiting blackberries. So similar to those red raspberries that you can prune to the ground and they fruit on new wood, University of Arkansas now has some thorny and thornless types of primocane fruiting blackberries. I have not grown them a lot or experimenting them with a lot in New Jersey yet. I've heard some reports out of some other states that the taste really wasn't great, again, with some of the earlier ones. So they're claiming that the newer ones, like Primark Freedom, is fairly new if you can get it from a nursery. So hopefully they've done some work to develop the flavor better, and that might be another alternative. Probably would take up less space than your giant regular floricane type fruiting blackberries. As far as taking up space and managing raspberries, a lot of gardeners and farmers like to trellis raspberries. And I was just in a community garden recently, and I noted, it's a little hard to see here, but they were using some little wire fences to kind of try and keep their raspberries in place and upright to ease harvest and to maintain their paths. I don't know how successful they will be over the long term, because the raspberries will get a couple feet taller than that, and when they wait up with fruit, I'm not sure they won't just push those pieces of wire over. So usually farmers and gardeners put a more substantial trellis in when they're growing raspberries or brambles, something with a post, and then they might have one or two cross beams, and then they have high tension wire in between. The idea is the canes grow up and they get to rest on that cane, staying upright, making harvest easier, keeping the thorny branches or canes of the bramble in place, and giving you a place to walk and harvest, and also helping a little bit with weed disease control. As far as completing this trellis, they do have devices from specialty agriculture and vineyard supply places that are spring-loaded that allow you to pull that wire through to maintain the tension. The other thing I want to mention about this trellis is, you note, as the canes grow up and weight this wire on the outside with the fruit, they'll tend to try and pull the post inward, which then loosens the wire. So they've got wire coming down to the ground and an anchor screwed into the ground in order to hold that post upright. So that helps to maintain that trellis and maintain it upright. The disadvantage of that is you've got a piece of wire out here. It can be a bit of a tripping hazard, and maintaining the area around that is kind of the downside. And so the other option in a small research planting we had at one of the research farms years ago, they put the support inside. So this allowed them to put it inside where the raspberries can just grow around it and in between, and you don't have this tripping hazard outside the outside post. So that's another option. You probably don't need something quite substantial if you've got a small garden row, but do know the plants can get quite heavy and put a lot of strain on that outside post and want to pull it in. Some pests and problems you might encounter with blackberries. One of the common ones we get in the extension offices is people will bring in a curled branch, and here you see one of the thorny types of blackberries, and the new growth is all curled and gnarled and twisted, and that's typically caused by the blackberry psyllid, the tiny sucking insect pest we see here that sucks the juices of the plant and injects a toxin that causes the plant to grow and get curled. It's hard to control with any kind of labeled pesticide, organically or even synthetically, and so typically we're just pruning those stems out and destroying them. Hopefully we caught the culprit in there in that stem when you dispose of it and reduce the local population. Luckily, again, blackberries are pretty vigorous, so you can prune out a pretty good chunk and still have some vigorous plant growth left and get a good harvest. Another problem we encounter a lot with small fruit, we see it maybe even more in strawberries in the wet spring, but gray mold is a fungal disease that gets onto the fruit of small fruit like brambles. It infects the flowers, and then later it grows this fungal growth on the fruit with all these spores to infect other fruit. Some of the things you can help to do to culturally maintain it, that's one of the big reasons for our pruning, our good air movement, so that the plants dry out and it doesn't create a situation that benefits the fungus. And then if we see these type of things, we want to keep those berries picked. We want to get rid of any rotted fruit and remove it from anywhere close to the bramble planting. Otherwise, the spores blow off and infect other flowers and infect other fruit. This is what I was mentioning when we talked about taking cuttings. This is the thing you want to be cautious of. There are some viruses. This is a healthy raspberry leaf, and this is a virus-infected leaf. So you can see it's slightly distorted. Sometimes you'll see mosaics or mottling. Those diseases are spread by aphids from plant to plant, and small insects. They transmit the virus from weeds. So we try to plant away from wild brambles, which wild brambles are everywhere, so that's difficult to do practically. But if you have a few right near your planting, you might want to get rid of them. But the other thing we can do, as far as instead of taking our own cuttings, we can buy plants from nurseries who go through a process of tissue culture and testing where they can eliminate virus diseases from plants. Homeowners and farmers can't, but researchers and nurserymen can take tiny cells from the growing tip, culture those cells, and know that there isn't any virus in it. There's also a heat treatment for the plants to eliminate the virus. They can grow them out of it, and then they propagate and have stock plants that they've known and tested virus-free. So you are pretty sure that when you get a plant from a good nursery, you're getting a plant that doesn't have a virus. If you're getting it from a cutting from a neighbor, you can't be quite as sure. You're only going by visual symptoms, and so that's the only downside to sharing cuttings for brambles. So then when it comes to harvest, note that brambles tend to be very soft fruit, fragile fruit, so we want to be careful with them. For red and gold raspberries, the trick, if it's in your garden or you pick your own farm, a gentle tug when they're ripe, they'll come off with that hollow center. You'll know if they hold on, they're probably not ripe yet. With blackberries, they go from reddish to a deep dark black, and they start off very glossy, and when they're very ripe, they turn a dull color. So if you keep picking the blackberries and they tend to be tart for you, And then you might want to look for more dull ones that have had a little bit more dull, less shiny on the surface, a little bit riper there and a little sweeter. And they tend to not really sweeten off the vine or cane, so both of them you want to pick dead ripe. Sometimes the commercial folks that need to ship them have to pick them earlier, which is one of the reasons why they don't have quite the flavor that we do in our home garden. We can harvest anywhere from 2 to 5 pounds per plant. You want to harvest often, get rid of those rotted fruit and misshapen fruit. Again, handle them very carefully. Refrigerate them immediately if you're haven't already eaten them immediately, but we want to wash them right before consuming. We don't want to wash them and put them in the refrigerator. Otherwise, you get rot from that. So wait till you're going to eat them before you wash your berries or brambles. And again, getting back to that slide earlier where we have gardeners asking me all the time, I have brambles, which one is it? And sometimes we can help identify it, but again, that is the reason to save the label. Sometimes we can get a clue from the fruit color, knowing that it's a purple raspberry or red raspberry or maybe a black raspberry. Sometimes we get a clue from the canes and looking at them, and this is the lavender sheen of a black raspberry cane, so we might be clued into that. The size of the thorns, the number of thorns may be another clue. And the one plant locally that a lot of people confuse with red raspberries is a plant called wineberry. It's actually an invasive species, a non-native species. It is edible, and apparently some people make wine out of it, but a lot of people treat it like a weed because it reseeds readily in the area and takes over garden areas and has those kind of itchy thorns, so we don't particularly want that. But a lot of people confuse that with red raspberry, which it's not. And so with cooperative extension, actually, we're very careful about telling people or caution people about harvesting from the woods when they think they know what the plant is, when they really don't. So there are people thinking they're harvesting a red raspberry. Luckily, in this case, if it was a wineberry, it wouldn't be toxic, but I can't tell you you're not going to harvest something else and think it's edible if you're not really good with plant ID. So we caution people about wild harvest. Be very careful and know your plants if you're ever going to attempt something like that. Bill, were there any other questions before I get into blueberries?
Pete, there was one question on storage. How long do typically, if you harvest them and as you said, you're not washing them, how long will they last in the refrigerator typically?
Yeah, it depends on what kind of shape they're in. They could easily last a week. I've seen listed 2 weeks. I think that might be pushing it a bit, but not washed, solid fruit, picked well, gently handled, probably can last a week.
And probably best to pick them early in the morning when it's cool.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, we'll for that and blueberries later. Definitely when it's cool, fruit accumulates heat during the day. So yeah, if you're going to go out and pick your own or pick your own from your garden, try and get out there early and get them when they're cool, so they don't have a lot of what we call field heat in the fruit.
Another question, Pete. Should they be cautious about planting raspberries near blackberries, or does it matter, kind of thing?
Planting the two, I mean, you need the space. So, considering they don't look like much when you plant them, but they'll fill that space. So space them out. But no, as long as neither of them have a virus, some of those viruses might go to both. But as long as they're clean plants, I wouldn't worry about planting them next to each other. So before we get into growing blueberries, I think Dave has a little video of history of blueberries in New Jersey.
Hi, my name is Gary Pavlis, and I'm the county agent in Atlantic County. I work for Rutgers Cooperative Extension. I work with the blueberry growers down here in South Jersey. I run a lot of the educational programs, I do research projects for them, and I do a lot of troubleshooting. I also have a blueberry newsletter. And if you've read that newsletter, you know that Hamilton is the blueberry capital of the world. But not far from here in Whitesbog in Burlington County is where the blueberry industry began. Legend has it that Elizabeth White, a cranberry grower up there, started selecting plants from the pine barrens. What she did was she had little pieces of wood that she had put holes in the size of her wedding ring. She gave these little pieces of wood to children, and they took them out in the fields, and if they could find a plant with a berry on it that wouldn't fit through that hole, she would give them a nickel, a dime, a quarter, and that's the beginning of selection for blueberry plants. These plants were brought back to her farm, and that's how fruit size was the first criteria for the blueberry industry. Today, the high-bush blueberry is grown in 37 states and 21 countries. Our blueberries in New Jersey are marketed primarily fresh market. The season starts around June 19th and it ends the first or second week of August. I've been working on the nutrition of the high-bush blueberry. What we've realized from our research is that the way we've been doing it is not very efficient. Our research has shown that if we make our fertilization applications later, at bloom and in late June, we could take a field that's producing 700 flats to the acre and increase it to 1,000 flats to the acre. In addition, if we put the same fertilizer through the trickle system, we can take a field that's doing the 1,000 flats to the acre and increase it to 1,400 flats to the acre. The blueberry growers in this area have adopted this new system and are very happy with it.
Okay, thanks, Dave. As you saw there, Gary is the agent down in Atlantic County, which is really the blueberry capital of New Jersey. It does a lot of work with the commercial growers down there. It's a huge industry. We're one of the leading blueberry states in the country, as he said, and we produce a tremendous amount of blueberries down there. We can produce blueberries, though, in other parts of the state, and so let's get a little bit into blueberry production. And one of the things about blueberries is that it's really an interesting plant and a nice plant for an edible landscape, because besides the edible fruit, it has interesting flowers in the spring, and it also has a really nice fall color. So fits in the landscape well, and so it's something you might want to consider for your home landscape. And I'll give you a couple considerations in order to have success with blueberries. So again, getting into site selection with blueberries. Again, we want full sun. There are blueberries grow wild in the woods of New Jersey and in the pine barrens, and people sometimes see them growing in the low-lying areas of South Jersey and in the pine barrens and think that's what they like or want. And they will flower and fruit with mixed sun, but if you go down and look for the blueberry producers down there, they are wide open fields, full sun. You'll note here that they also mound up, make ridges on the commercial production fields because they don't particularly like wet feet, and they can get root rot diseases if they sit wet. So they're mounded up. They're not sitting in a puddle in a swamp. They're not grown in commercially in a swamp in order to get the maximized production. And also note that in South Jersey, it's a very sandy soil too, so it has very good drainage for those blueberry bushes. So they don't like low areas. They like some good drainage. They like sandy soils, but they can also be grown in the silt and clay soils of northern New Jersey. Pretty much all the industry down there is high bush blueberries, and they can get pretty high, 8 to 10 feet tall. So they can become a large plant over time. And if you talk to Gary or have seen him give other lectures, he'll tell you that the three most important thing about blueberries is pH, pH, and pH. So this is a crop that a soil test is almost essential in order to have success with growing them in the home garden. They are an acid-loving crop. They like acid soils. And so you saw the Brambles were 6 to 6.5. This is 4 to 4.8, which in some of the areas in South Jersey, it might be in that range. But North Jersey, Central and North Jersey, if you believe there's a Central Jersey, are more 5.5 or something like that. So typically, after we do a soil test, it's going to tell us, instead of adding lime, it's going to tell us to add sulfur to our soil, and at least 2 months before planting in order to get the pH to that range. Otherwise, the blueberry plant can't take up nutrients properly, and this is a common problem we see with blueberries. Let me pull out my laser pointer. What we call intraveinal chlorosis, which is a telltale sign of iron deficiency. There may be iron in the soil, but the soil pH is too high, and the plant can't take it up and becomes deficient, will grow very slowly or not at all. So we do need to run that soil test and get that sulfur recommendation and get the pH in the proper range. Blueberries also have shallow feeder roots, fibrous roots, and they enjoy a lot of organic matter to the soil. So we want to amend the soil with lots of good organic matter. This is one of the crops. I typically don't recommend peat moss a lot in the home garden. I save that for greenhouses and pots. But in this case, it's a really good organic matter source that also helps to acidify the soil. So adding peat moss is a real good idea for blueberries. You can, again, also add compost and manure. Will also amend the soil and add to the organic matter. As far as spacing typical high bush blueberries, we're moving them out again, or they can get big over time. They won't look like much at first, but you want 4 feet between plants to still the space and 10 feet between the rows. As I said, they can get 8 to 10 feet tall in the garden or on the farm. Brambles, you can get smaller plants in the spring. If you were still looking to plant things, you probably want a more established blueberry plant, 2 or 3 years old. And also, you could consider growing blueberries in containers. The one thing with any crop in container, and you could do it with brambles as well, is you have to consider the growing area, the mix. So in this case, we would want to find a planting mix that has a low pH. And do remember, when you're growing plants in containers, it's a little bit more challenging. They're more dependent on you for water and fertilizer, so you've got to be more vigilant. There's a bigger buffer in the soil when you plant something in the ground than in containers. But some people have been successful growing blueberries in containers. In this case, it's in a fabric pot here, so I'm not sure they were going to keep them in there or plant them in the ground eventually. The other thing about growing them in containers on top of the soil or on your patio and such, in the winter, we don't want that root system to freeze solid, so you have to do something and potentially move that container or put it in an area that shelters that root system, maybe mulch it, put straw bales around it, do something so that the freezing and thawing cycles don't damage the root system in the winter. So it can be done. It's a little bit more of an advanced thing, and it takes a little bit more care in order to grow any of these crops in containers. And we'll talk about some varieties you might want to use for that in the next couple slides. As far as establishing blueberries in the home garden, you want to add some amendments. And again, peat moss is a good idea. We recommend a gallon of peat moss in each planting hole to add that organic matter. We want to keep those plants well watered. And blueberries, it's a little more important than brambles, kind of establish quickly and are almost, again, like weeds. Blueberries can be slow to establish a little bit, and so we actually remove the flowers the first few years, sacrifice the fruit in order to establish the root system and the top and establish the bush, and then we were harvesting the years after that. Talking to Gary one time, he was talking about a variety that flowered so much the first year that it actually put all its energy into the flowers and fruit and killed itself. So we definitely don't want a large harvest off those. If a gardener snuck 1 or 2 fruit, I won't tell anybody, but the idea the first 2 years is to establish the bush and so that you have a better yield later. And again, organic matter is key and moderating the soil moisture there. So a good idea is to add a couple inches of mulch around the plants to again have that slowly break down around the root system. Blueberries thrive on organic matter in the soil. Fertilization is a little bit different with blueberries and brambles as well. Again, it's ideal to have a soil test to know what's in your soil, how much, and then have a specific recommendation for your site. This is a general recommendation. If you don't have a soil test of a fertilizer type that you can apply, and you'll note here that it's ammonium sulfate, a sulfur fertilizer with sulfur in it. That's going to also help to drive the pH down and keep it down in your soil. So we wouldn't put this on all crops, but ammonium sulfate or other acidifying fertilizers are typically recommended. Polytone and Meracid are some trade names of other fertilizer types that are designed for rhododendrons and things like blueberries that like low pH. So those fertilizers add the nutrients as well as tend to help keep the pH down. As far as pollination goes, so brambles typically are self-fertile and you don't need to worry much at all about pollination. Blueberries can be a little bit more tricky. They can be self-fruitful and the flower can fertilize itself, but really if we want large crops of early berries, cross-pollination is important, and so we're trying to plant a couple different varieties to get that cross-pollination that are flowering and fruiting at about the same time. As far as picking varieties of blueberries, there's many to choose from. We have a fact sheet I'll show you at the end talking about different blueberry varieties. Again, blueberries can also get virus diseases that once they're in the plant, they won't come out. You can't really cure them. They'll stop the growth. They'll have misshapen growth sometimes where they just won't grow properly. So we want to go to a reliable nursery that has virus testing and has virus-clean stock plants that they're propagating from, so that at least when you start, they'll be virus-free. Insects can fly in and pass these viruses on later, but at least you know your starting place is clean if you go to a good nursery. There are different varieties for different seasons, so there's lots of recommendations we have here of different varieties for each season that can be grown in the home garden of high bush blueberry types. These are all the high bush types. There's also production of low bush types of blueberries in other areas of the country. For example, Maine grows a lot of low bush blueberries, some of which grow wild, some are kind of cultivated. But researchers from the University of Minnesota crossed high bush and low bush and produced what they call half-highs. So the high bush types grow 8 to 10 feet tall, the half-highs 3 to 4, maybe 5 feet tall. And so if you're doing a landscape planting or have a smaller space, you might want to look into some of these half-high varieties, or also if you were considering growing them in containers. You might want to consider the half-highs. I also mentioned here a specialty blueberry called pink lemonade that came up the last couple of years. That actually was a variety developed at the USDA breeding program, which we cooperate with at Rutgers down at the Chatsworth Research Center. It actually ripens up pink. So if you want something completely different, you might try that pink lemonade. I find it a little bit odd for a blueberry to be pink, but you know, everybody's got their tastes. As far as maintaining blueberries long-term and pruning, what we want to do with blueberries is a renewal type of pruning. So the first couple of years, we're not doing a whole lot of pruning. We're establishing the bush, letting it grow out. Again, the first couple of years, removing the flowers, get that plant vigorous, roots established and growing well. And then when we get into 3 or 4 years, when the bush is well established, now we're going to come back, remove weak, dead, and non-erect canes, so anything coming down, falling off, or really spindly. And then in the 5th year, we're going to come in and remove 1 of every 6 of the oldest canes. So we would come in here and probably remove this cane. This would take out a good portion of a bush, but you'll notice as that cane gets older, one of our faculty used to say the plumbing gets bad, and the fruit on that cane, the older canes, is not as large and vigorous. So we want these keep coming on. We want to encourage these young, vigorous canes. So we'll come in and remove 1 or 2 of the older canes, and that revigorates the plant, causes more young canes to come up and produce higher yields and better fruit. The big problem with blueberries is that birds like them as much as humans do, and gardeners have come up with all kinds of scare tactics to keep birds out, particularly of their blueberries. The birds seem to know exactly when they're ripe, the moment before you discover that they're ripe. And so gardeners have all kinds of scare tactics, and farmers, they have balloons, they've got ribbons, mylar tape that reflects in the wind, fake birds of prey, and bird distress calls have all been used to some success. With all of these things, you want to put them up right before you want to protect your blueberries. So just as the fruit's approaching ripening, you put them up so that the birds don't get used to it. You want to move it around, change it up. I've seen birds perched on fake birds of prey like owls. So obviously that was no longer scaring those birds. So move those owls around. Some of the owls have bobbing heads and movement to them, but if it stays in the same place every day, the birds get used to it and realize, yeah, that owl is not real and not a threat to me. Those scare tactics work to some degree, but never close to 100%. So a lot of gardeners resort to netting. Again, another thing you probably want to drape over your plants close to harvest. This was my neighbor's planting. He just took rebar and bent them over and then threw bird netting over the top. And this is a community garden where they use PVC, and again, drape netting over the top. The one key, you want to make sure the netting all goes down to the ground and it's secured, because you don't want to get birds up in there and then flying around, and getting them out of that cage once they're in can be really a hassle and not nice for the birds. So bird netting is the more sure plan versus scaring. Both can work, but again, if you're going to scare them, you want to mix things up and change things up in order for that to be effective for you. And with that, the blueberry harvest is going on now. Starts in mid-June, and with the different varieties, can extend all the way to mid-August. You want to pick deep blue fruit with a dusting of gray on the surface. You can harvest anywhere from 3 to 10 pounds per plant. Gary was mentioning some of those massive harvests that the commercial growers get down in Hamilton area with the good cultural practices. Again, we want to harvest often as the fruit ripen up, pick those ripe ones off and let those other ones develop, handle them carefully, refrigerate immediately, and wash right before consuming. And again, they'll last a week or two in the refrigerator if they're intact, and we'll harvest it. Before we get into pick your own, Bill, do you have any questions?
Yes, we have a few questions here, Peter. Someone had asked about genetic variability with some of these plants and varieties. When we order online or when we get our plants, how much variability can we expect on raspberry or blackberry varieties in general?
Well, from a good nursery, they should be maintaining their genetic stock and taking cuttings or tissue cultured plants from that stock, and shouldn't be too variable. You should read the name variety, and it should look like the catalog or the description. So if you're getting a lot of variability, you might want to, unless you want that, you want to rethink the nursery.
Also, another question on in terms of encouraging. I know Gary talked about it, but the fertility. In the video with Gary, he talked about when they flower to give them a little bit of fertilizer at that point, and that can encourage a little bit higher production.
Yeah, you could come back then and give a little bit of fertilizer. You usually want the flowering to it's kind of established. I think they were in the past putting all the fertilizer up front. It depends on where you're from, because it's a little bit more tricky and key, your fertilizer timing on a sandy soil where he's working than it is on a silt loam or some of the more northern soils. So the more you're gardening, if you have more clay, this can stay around longer. It's more balanced, but on sand, it goes away pretty quick.
There was one question, Peter, on white areas on blackberries. You'll have the black and you'll have the white discoloration. Can you just talk a little bit about discoloration in berries?
Yeah, we see that sometimes, and a lot of times that's sun scald. If it gets real hot, and the sun is beating on the berries in a hot day, you'll get that. There may be some other issues with some insects and such, but and also actually sometimes there's diseases, virus diseases that cause what they call crumbly berry, where the drupelet will fall apart, and so that might indicate a virus problem.
And you had talked about amending the more compact soils and clay soils, but if someone were to want to grow these that has a heavy soil with not the greatest drainage in the world, what are some of the things that they could do if they want to really get started in this?
Yeah, it'd be best if you could loosen it, till it up or turn it and loosen it. But then also you could add amendments. Organic matter improves the soil structure, improves drainage. And then if you still think it's poorly drained, you might want to create a raised bed and use some mulch on top of that to get it up a little bit higher, set the plant, the crown of the plant a little bit higher so that it's not sitting in a puddle if you don't really trust your drainage.
There's a question here on propagating, taking cuttings for propagating, I guess with blueberries.
Yeah, usually either softwood cuttings in the spring with rooting hormone. I don't have all the details off the top of my head. We could maybe get their email and get them more information on that.
How about any few companies where you could get some of the recommended varieties you were mentioning, whether it's Brambles or Blueberries?
I'll skip to the end real quick. I just listed a couple of small fruit specialty nurseries that have some of the rarer things and more common things. But there's also some of the local garden centers, some of the local farms. Some of the local farms will pot up. They'll buy a bunch to plant and then pot some up and sell them to you. So that's another source. And when we're back in contact and have plant sales, there might be another source of some of those plants. Okay, well then I just want to talk about pick your own. Again, these crops are in season now, so you want to get out and if you don't have them in your garden already, if you're not able to get plants in the ground this year or your plants are young, definitely go to the Department of Agriculture's Find Jersey Fresh website. You can click on the Pick Your Own tab there and enter your location and find the Pick Your Own fruits or vegetables that you want. Again, they grow some of these varieties. They are fresh, tremendously tastier often than the supermarket, which supplies you with things year-round, but they have to grow varieties that are more shippable and may not have the flavor and not always picked at the peak in order to be able to ship them to you. So that's one source of information, that Find Jersey Fresh site for Pick Your Own operations. And I think in Bill's videos, we also mentioned the Visit Jersey Farms. And so that also can be used to identify and find some of the local growers growing brambles and blueberries. You want to take your family out on a nice day and get some Pick Your Own raspberries, blackberries, and blueberries.
Pete, thanks. We have a question here on washing again. Just if they see pest on there, just, what to use. And I think we responded to, soap and water works fine. Or not soap, but just plain water. And not to use, to overwash things, and you want to wash them right before you're getting ready to eat them and not ahead of time. I think you had mentioned that in your talk today.
Yeah, you just want to wash them with cold water. You really kind of want to stay away from soaps and things. Our food science specialist, Don Schaffner, typically recommends just water. There's all kinds of produce washes and things, and I don't think he's found them to be much better than just rinsing them well in water.
I just want to remind people that we have programs that go on throughout the year. Typically, we have Master Gardener programs that start in the fall, but some of those may be delayed due to our current issue with COVID-19. But you want to look for, programs, we will be promoting many of our programs throughout the year, and each county throughout the state has a magnificent Master Gardener program where you learn by doing, and you reach out and you do a lot of great volunteer work for those communities. That has been put on a hold right now because of the COVID situation, but we hope to, in the not too distant future, get back to having Master Gardener volunteers out and about. But it is a great opportunity for all of you. Peter and I also teach other programs throughout the state. There's many different workshops that are offered in each county. And many of my colleagues that help us out with this program will do programs throughout the state in a typical year, but we've kind of switched over to this online program because of our current virus situation. But any of the things that we've talked about today with Peter are going to be available online. These resources that you see here that Peter's listed, they will be available at the New Jersey Ag Experiment Station site. I want to thank Peter for sharing his expertise and time today. Pete, we greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule because we know this is a very busy time of the year for everybody in our group. So thank you so much for sharing with everyone. And we hope to see everyone next Thursday night when our colleague Megan Muehlbauer will talk about tree fruit production and varieties for the home garden. If you like these programs, please let your freeholders know, too, that you're benefiting from cooperative extension programs. And, you know, reach out and just put in a good word for us once in a while. And that can really help because we get a lot of great support from our freeholders, and we truly appreciate the support that they give us. And especially the support that New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station gives us. So we're all part of one big family, and we're here to serve your needs. So make sure you get in touch with us. And if you have any questions, many of our counties have Master Gardeners that can answer your questions, and they're actively working right now answering questions online. So make sure you contact your county Master Gardeners. If you have any detailed questions or you want to send samples, I think many of the counties are starting to take samples again, those that have been able to open back up. So just check with your local county cooperative extension office. So with that, we're going to sign off tonight. I really appreciate your expertise, Pete, and thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thanks for having me, Bill, and I appreciate all the attendees tuning in, and hopefully you learned a little bit. And like Bill said, support the other programs and check out your local county extension office. They'll have more information and can address questions that you might have.
Stay safe.